There are cavities in these ancient mountains that consume things completely and never release them. Not remains, not identities. Whole families, entire chapters of human existence. What's peculiar isn't what vanishes. What's peculiar is what remains. A boot resting by the entrance. Bread proofing on the windowsill. A letter with ink still glistening, still slanting left the way she always penned it. Coffee in a cup that hasn't cooled yet. A wrap draped over a chair back that still retains the silhouette of the shoulders that wore it. Before this narrative begins, tell me your location tonight. What territory? What shade of darkness? Put it down below so I know who's accompanying me. I enjoy envisioning the veranda lights, the cooking spaces, the vehicles pulled to the roadside. Those of you listening during the overnight shift with machinery humming behind you. It assists me. A quick note before commencing. If the type of account I'm sharing appeals to you, and you desire more, not just one but 10, each delivered comprehensively in a voice suited for darkness, there exists a compilation called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 records from 10 districts, 5 states spanning 18-1945. Every single one involved people who ventured into seemingly harmless terrain, and each received official closure with the incorrect terminology. 10 hours to experience in the darkness from beginning to end. The link is in the description and secured at the top of the comments section. Now then, this one originates from Randolph County, West Virginia, during autumn of 1904. A ravine so narrow that sunlight only reached its floor for roughly 4 hours daily and exclusively during summer. Come October, the light arrived sharp and harsh and departed before you could absorb any warmth from it. Residents called it Widow's Cut, though no living person could identify which widow or why. Ephraim Judd, whom you'll encounter shortly, informed me his grandfather had mentioned the name predated the county itself, dating back to when the high ground belonged to Shawnee territory and no white settler had designated the location. The name already existed when they arrived. They merely translated it at Cut's Head, where the deer trail narrowed and the terrain began tilting back toward the ridge. A family maintained a farm nobody should have maintained. The Ashfords. 5 of them throughout most of the year. Then one September morning, none remained. The individual who discovered the place abandoned was named Alaric Fenn, 41 years old. Tall in that manner quiet men sometimes become, with fingers stained blue at the tips from the county's carbon paper. Assistant Assessor Second, class from Elkins. His responsibility involved inspecting properties whose owners had stopped responding to correspondence, examining roofs, boundary lines, and grazing fields, then documenting whether the land justified its tax obligations. Cold work, largely silent. Most entries in his memorandum book concerned things like collapsed roofing, rotting foundation timbers, hay prices per bale in the local marketplace, and what neighbors mentioned when he asked about a family's whereabouts. Ordinary matters. County work. He'd performed this job for 7 years. He was skilled at it. He carried a leather satchel, a rifle he'd never discharged at anything bigger than a jackrabbit, and a compact memorandum book he wrote in each evening using a stub of soft graphite. It's that book, or what was subsequently transcribed from it by the Elkins court clerk, that provides most of what we now know about the Ashford property. Fenn was dispatched upward during the 3rd week of October. The Ashfords hadn't submitted their annual return for 2 consecutive years, and the county wanted an inspection before winter sealed the passage. He departed Elkins on a Tuesday, rode a rented mule to a settlement called Salt Lick Bend, and from there continued on foot. Salt Lick Bend no longer appears on contemporary maps. In 1904, it comprised 14 houses, a post office no larger than a storage closet, and a store selling nails, flour, and lamp oil from the same 3 barrels. No church existed. There had been one on the rise above the settlement, but it burned in 1896 and was never rebuilt. Those wanting a minister rode to Beverly. Most didn't bother. Fenn arrived just before nightfall. He recorded in his journal that the postmaster, a man named Ephraim Judd, refused to accept the letter of introduction from his hand. Ephraim Judd made him place it on the counter and slide it over, reading it without physical contact. Then Ephraim Judd asked him very deliberately which specific farm he was visiting. Fenn informed him, the Ashford place, Widow's Cut. Ephraim Judd stood there for an extended period. Then he made a statement Fenn transcribed precisely as spoken, because he didn't comprehend it at the time. What Judd said was, "Well then, I hope you brought illumination that doesn't require striking." And he closed the post office window shutter and departed homeward. Fenn remained in the empty post office for a moment afterward, clutching the letter before realizing the conversation had concluded. That initial evening over supper at a boarding house, all operated by a woman named Delphia Mowat, Fenn began perceiving the contours of what he'd been dispatched into. Delphia Mowat was a widow aged 50, with a face that had grown quiet from years of withholding words. She served him salt pork, cornbread, and coffee that tasted as if it had been simmering since the war. He inquired politely about the Ashfords. She regarded him over her cup's rim momentarily before stating, "They were good people, Miss Fenn," which represents how locals here speak of the deceased. He asked when they departed. She responded, "Departed isn't the appropriate term." He asked what the appropriate term was. She said, "There isn't one." He recorded both statements verbatim. Fenn slept that night beneath a window that refused to stay latched. The wind persistently nudged it open. He rose 3 times to secure it, and on the 3rd occasion, he observed a light moving on the ridge above the Ashford holding. Not a lantern. Too dim, too deliberate. He watched it for the better portion of an hour. It didn't travel anywhere. It didn't extinguish. It simply hovered above the tree line, the way a match rests on a damp leaf. And eventually, he couldn't distinguish anymore whether it was moving or if his eyes were simply fatigued. He closed the window and didn't reopen it. In the morning, he asked Delphia Mowat about it. She said, "Oh, that's merely the mill wheel." And Fenn recorded in his journal, "But the mill wheel is at the cut's bottom, not the top." She didn't respond. She poured more coffee. She asked if he intended to go up there today. He confirmed he did. She said, "Take a piece of bread with you. Consume it before you cross the wheel." He asked why. She replied, "Because a person on this terrain with an empty stomach will perceive things incorrectly." He placed a portion of her bread in his coat pocket. He didn't eat it. He would later wish he had. He departed for the Ashford farm at 8 in the morning. The route from Salt Lick Bend followed Bitter Creek for approximately a mile, then diverged up a deer trail so narrow he had to proceed single file. Fenn later noted that the walk's strangest aspect was how the sound transformed. The creek, which had been loud enough at the settlement to carry away a person's voice, fell silent within 15 minutes. Not softer. Silent, as though someone had placed a hand over its mouth. He noticed then that no birds were singing. Not one. The entire ravine on a clear, cold October morning was as quiet as a sealed room. He continued walking. The trees flanking the path were typical of that region. Oak, beech, and hickory primarily, with occasional hemlock stands where the ground remained damp. Nothing remarkable, nothing amiss. He recorded in his journal that the woods themselves seemed normal. Only their sound felt wrong. And once, about halfway up, he thought he detected movement in the trees to his left at shoulder height, maintaining pace with him. He halted. Whatever it was, halted too. He resumed walking. Whatever it was, resumed as well. He would write later that evening. I'm not going to articulate what I believed it was, because naming it will give it identity, and I'm not yet prepared to assign it identity. He wrote elsewhere. The ground in that ravine doesn't welcome you. It waits for you to make the initial move. The Ashford place occupied a shelf of level terrain approximately 200 yards below the ridgeline. A hand-hewn log cabin roughly 30 years old by his estimation, featuring a stone chimney and wooden roof shingles, a milking shed, a pole barn, a pasture, and a split, rail fence surrounding a kitchen garden gone to seed. At the property's lower boundary stood an undershot mill wheel on a small tributary descending from the trees. The wheel was rotating. That constituted the first thing Fenn noted about the property. The wheel was rotating, though nobody had processed grain through it in months, judging by the hopper's appearance. And though the stream feeding it was so low, he could observe moss on the stones beneath the water. It was rotating, and it made no sound. Every mill wheel Fenn had ever witnessed rotating produced noise. Wood groaning, water splashing, friction in the axle. This one turned as though a child had illustrated it, turning without any of the sound's actual objects make when moving. He approached the cabin. He knocked. Nobody answered. The door wasn't locked. He announced the county's name and his own loudly. Nothing. He pushed the door open. What he discovered inside constitutes where the case begins and how it's remembered. The table was arranged for 4, not 5. 4. Food sat on the table. Cornbread that had gone hard. Boiled greens turned black at the edges. A pot of beans on the stove that remained untouched, yet hadn't completely spoiled. The way beans won't completely spoil in cold weather, over an extended period. A shawl draped over one chair's back, a pipe on the mantelpiece, cold, but with fresh tobacco residue in the bowl, as if its owner had set it down to answer a knock. On the sideboard lay a piece of paper. Fenn transcribed its contents into his journal letter by letter. In feminine handwriting, careful and unfinished, it read, Dear Callum, we have decided about the Sarvis Grove, and your father and I both feeled. And that's where the pen had stopped. A small pool of ink remained at the last word's end, as if the pen had been set down that very moment. Fenn stood in the doorway for what he later calculated as 4 full minutes without moving. He then went outside and vomited into the frost-killed corn. He wasn't, by his own account, a man prone to weak constitutions. He'd walked through a barn fire once, a flooded mine, and a house where an elderly woman had passed in her sleep and remained undiscovered for 11 days. None of those affected him. This one did, and he couldn't explain why in his memorandum. He only wrote, There is no odor in the house. And this is the wrong thing about it. He was correct about that. No smell existed, not of the beans which should have soared, not of the pipe which should have retained scent, not of the people which the dwelling should have retained too, the way any occupied house retains the essence of its inhabitants. Perspiration, hair, lamp oil, skin. Nothing, he wrote. It smells like a house that has been cleaned, and underlined the word, cleaned, twice. He worked his way through the cabin without touching what he didn't need to touch. 2 rooms downstairs, 1 loft above. In the loft, 3 straw mattresses arranged neatly with folded blankets. On the wall beside the loft window, someone had sketched in soft graphite a picture of a tree. Not an actual tree, but one with too many branches. The branches wrapped downward around the trunk and curled back into themselves. Where their tips converged, small circles appeared, each shaded dark. Fenn counted them. 9 circles. He didn't know why he counted. He wrote, They are eyes. But I don't know how I know. Beneath the drawing, a smaller mark nearly missed. A date September 2nd, 1904. Below that, in the same soft graphite, 3 words, "Do not look." Back downstairs on the mantel behind the cold pipe sat a leather-bound account book. He took it. He would later testify before the county judge that he took it because it was the only document on the property that clearly identified the family and their holdings. And that was his job. He was truthful, but not completely truthful. He also took it because he didn't want to leave it in the house. The book contained 4 names inscribed inside the front cover: Cassius Ashford, born 1850, Mary Beth Ashford, born 1853, Absalom Ashford, born 1876, O.T. Ashford, born 1880. A 5th name appeared above them in older ink with a line drawn through it: Callum Ashford, born 1874. Fenn stood on the empty cabin's porch examining the 4 names and the crossed-out 5th for a considerable time. Then he closed the book, placed it in his satchel, and began the descent back to Salt Lick Bend. He'd gone perhaps 50 yards when he heard the mill wheel stop. He wrote, "I didn't turn around. I didn't turn around because I knew without understanding how I knew that if I turned around, the wheel would be rotating again." That constitutes the first day at the Ashford place. And since we're here, this narrative is being presented by the presence behind you. If you've accompanied me this far, please subscribe and activate notifications. It enables me to continue sharing these accounts. And if you're hearing this on another channel not ours, understand it was taken without authorization. Report it so we can retrieve it. Now tell me, have you ever experienced that sensation of entering a space that wasn't empty, that was recently vacated, the kind of recently that hasn't concluded yet? Share it in the comments if you have. I'm curious to know. Fenn returned to Salt Lick Bend shortly after 2 in the afternoon. He asked Delphia Mowat for a private table and sat with the Ashford account book for the remainder of the day. What he discovered within that book wasn't what he anticipated. It wasn't a farm ledger. From about the midpoint onward, it constituted a running record of things Cassius Ashford couldn't explain and was attempting in his careful farmer's handwriting to explain anyway. The first entry that arrested Fenn's attention was dated April 1903. Cassius had written, "Cow number 2 won't go past the wheel. Been standing at the near post for an hour. Absalom drove her. She came back. Tomorrow we'll try leading." A 3-week gap followed. Then, cow number 2 still won't go past the wheel. And now cow number 4 won't either. Mary Beth says leave them be. Dozens of such entries spanned a year and a half. Not many words each. The way a man unaccustomed to writing records only what must be said. The dog won't go past the wheel. The chickens won't go past the wheel. Absalom went past the wheel for firewood. Came back with an armload. Said the birds sound wrong up there. Odie won't go past the wheel and won't say why. And then one undated entry in slightly different handwriting, as if written hastily. We'd heard the axe again. It wasn't any of us. It wasn't on our land. It was on our land. Another entry dated June 1904. Walked out to the near post of the wheel to feed the chickens their evening scratch. Saw a man standing about 15 yards up the deer path in the trees. He was facing away. He wore a Sunday coat. He didn't move the entire time I stood there. I called out to him. He didn't turn. I went back inside. Mary Beth didn't want to hear about it. She said if you didn't know him, then he wasn't there for you. I've thought about that response for 4 days. One more entry from the same month. Fenn read it twice before transcribing it. I don't think the man in the coat was a stranger. I think he was my father. This next portion I ask you to pause and breathe before continuing. If this is the type of case you'd like to experience in darkness, not just once but to preserve, there's a collection I've assembled. For those at forbidden unresolved stories, What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 60 2 years of records nobody wanted to finalize. Each positioned, dated, and concluded with a tidy word that never matched what occurred. The link is in the description below and at the comments top. Let's return. Fenn worked through the account book until daylight faded, then lit a lamp and continued by its glow. Delphia Mowat brought him supper and didn't speak. She stood in the doorway once, observing the book in his hands, and said only, "You shouldn't read that in this house." He looked up. She said, "Take it to the church. Read it there." He said, "There is no church." She said, "I know." She departed. He didn't know what to make of that. He recorded in his memorandum that night, "Delphia Mowat is either the most sensible person in this ravine or the least, and I can't yet determine which." That night he awakened sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning to the sound of someone walking on the boarding house porch. Slow steps, even, bare feet on cold planks. He lay in bed listening. The steps traversed the porch's length from the far end to the near end and stopped at his window. He heard the person breathe. He heard breath fog on the glass. He didn't rise. He didn't light the lamp. He waited. After what he estimated as 4 full minutes, the steps retreated down the porch as they'd come. When Fenn asked Delphia Mowat in the morning if she'd heard anything during the night, she said, "I heard my husband, Mr. Fenn. I hear him some nights. He's been dead 19 years. It doesn't trouble me anymore. It shouldn't trouble you." He transcribed her exact words into his journal. He walked to see Ephraim Judd at his farm the following morning, a mile from the settlement on Bitter Creek's far side. Ephraim Judd was 68, thin with clothes, cropped white hair, hands like exposed roots, and one eye gone milky blue from an old injury he didn't explain. He met Fenn at the fence and didn't invite him inside. He said, "Walk with me a bit." They walked alongside the creek. Ephraim Judd told him this, and Fenn recorded it as close to the original phrasing as he could recall. Cassius Ashford was a good farmer. Not clever, but careful. The family up there kept to themselves the way we all kept to ourselves, because that's how you survive in a ravine. But there was something that ran in that family that didn't run in ours. He continued. Cassius's father, whose name was Zephaniah Ashford, took up that piece of ground in 1869. He was a Union man returning from the war with a rifle, a limp, and his savings. He chose that ground because nobody else wanted it. Fenn asked why nobody else wanted it. Ephraim Judd walked a bit further without answering. Then he said, "My grandfather told me, when I was a boy, that the ground at Widow's Cut's Head was a place where the mountain went thin." Fenn asked what that meant. Ephraim Judd said, "It means exactly what it says. The ground up there isn't as substantial as it should be, and things on the other side can be heard through it." My grandfather said his grandfather had been told the same. "It's old country up there, Mr. Fenn. People walked it long before us, and there's a reason none of them stayed." Zephaniah Ashford didn't care about any of that. He was a war man. He built his cabin. He raised his family. And he died in his bed at 70, 2 of nothing I could identify in 1889. But he died with his eyes open. Fenn. His widow told me herself. She sat with him for 2 hours after his last breath, and his eyes didn't close. She had to place pennies on them. And the pennies fell off. 3 times, she said, the pennies fell off. The 3rd time she left them off and buried him with his eyes open, telling the preacher not to comment, and the preacher didn't comment. She lived 4 more months, then went to Ohio to be with her sister, and none of us in Salt Lick Bend ever heard from her again. Fenn transcribed all of this. Ephraim Judd continued. After Zephaniah died, Cassius took over. Cassius was steady. He worked. He married Mary Beth from Pocahontas County. She was a good woman, could carry a tune. They had 4 born. Fenn stopped him. 4. Ephraim Judd confirmed. 4. Callum was the eldest. Then a stillborn they buried at the pasture's edge without naming. Then Absalom. Then Oti. Fenn wrote, 4 born, 3 grown, 1 unnamed at the pasture's edge. Ephraim Judd said, Callum left in 94 when he was 20. His father sent him off, not for any wrongdoing. His father took him aside one evening and told him, you go to Ohio. You write to us when you arrive, and you don't come back. Ephraim Judd knew this because Callum had come to him the night before leaving and asked him to keep a letter for his mother in case he never sent one himself. Ephraim Judd asked Callum why his father was sending him away. Callum said, my father said one of us has to be somewhere else. That's all he said. Fenn asked if Callum did what he was told. Ephraim Judd confirmed, Callum did what he was told. He's a plant foreman in Cincinnati now. 2 children of his own. He writes to Mary Beth every Christmas. She writes back. Fenn asked, and the others? Ephraim Judd stopped walking. He said, the others stayed. The others were the ones the ground was keeping. Ephraim Judd said, I want to tell you something, and I want you to record it in your book so it's not just me who knows. There was a night in August of this past year. I was walking my fence line along the creek. It was warm, moonless. I heard coming down from Widow's Cut a sound like an axe on wood, steady the way a man splits wood who knows how. Not fast, not slow. I stopped and counted the strokes, 43. Then it stopped, and from a completely different direction, out of the woods behind me. Not from the cut at all. I heard another 43 strokes, the same rhythm, the same intervals. As if a man were answering himself. I went home. I didn't go out again that night. I wrote the date on my kitchen wall and haven't painted over it. It's there still. Fenn recorded August 15, 1904, per Ephraim Judd. He asked if he'd told anyone. Ephraim Judd said, I told the sheriff. He asked if I'd been drinking. I said no. He asked if I was certain. I said, Sheriff, I haven't touched liquor since my wife passed in 89. He said, well, Ephraim, I don't know what to tell you. I said, I don't want you to tell me anything. I want you to know the Ashfords are in trouble. And he said, Ephraim, the Ashfords are always fine. Ephraim Judd looked at Fenn, then with both his good eye and blind one simultaneously, which is uncomfortable to experience, and said, and now they're not, are they? Ephraim Judd shared one more thing before Fenn departed. In September, about 3 weeks before you arrived, Mary Beth Ashford walked all the way down to my farm on foot. She'd never done that in 18 years, never come down off her own ground to mine. She came to the fence. She wouldn't enter the yard. She stood there with folded hands and looked at me and said, Ephraim, if any of us come down to see you in the next month or so, don't open your door. Don't answer the knock. Don't look through the window. That's all she said. Then she walked back up. I sat on my porch and watched her go until the trees closed around her. I didn't open my door for anyone that entire month. When you arrived yesterday, Mr. Fenn, my hands were shaking before you were halfway across the yard because I couldn't remember at first who you were. Fenn walked back into Salt Lick Bend that afternoon. He went directly to the sheriff. The sheriff was a man named Roderick Vance, 44, black-haired, former cavalry sergeant who'd returned home in 98 and taken the badge because nobody else in the district wanted it. He kept his office in his own home's front room. He listened to Fenn for a long while without speaking. Then he said, all right, I'll ride up with you tomorrow. Fenn said, is that all? Roderick Vance said, Mr. Fenn, I've been sheriff of this district 6 years, and there's never been a call-up Widow's Cut I could do anything about. Missing dog, missing sheep, missing man once in 99. We searched a week. Found his coat folded on a rock at the Sarvis Grove's edge. Never found him. His widow moved to Ohio to be with her sister. So when I say I'll ride up with you tomorrow, I'm not saying I'll find your Ashfords. I'm saying I won't let you go alone. That's the best I can offer. They rode up in the morning, cold enough for their breath to hang. The creek remained silent. Still no birds. They tied the mules at the fence and proceeded on foot. Fenn later said the wheel hadn't been rotating when they first rounded the bend, but as they approached the cabin, about 50 yards out, it began to turn, slowly at first, then gathering speed. Roderick Vance stopped on the path. He looked at the wheel. He said, "That's been like that for a while." Fenn said, "No, it just started." Roderick Vance said, "No, it's been like that for a while." And Fenn understood then that they wouldn't be able to discuss the same thing simultaneously in this ravine, that the ravine made it impossible. He recorded that observation that night. Inside the cabin, nothing had changed. The letter remained, the ink at its end still wet. Roderick Vance touched it with his fingertip. It came away blue. He didn't comment. He walked through the house the way a sheriff does, opening drawers, checking under beds, lifting chest lids. In the loft, he stood for a long time examining the tree drawing with 9 circles. Coming back down, he said, "Mr. Fenn, I'm going to request a warrant from the county to excavate the pasture's edge." Fenn asked why. Roderick Vance said, "Because Ephraim told you what he told you, and because that drawing upstairs isn't one I want to observe longer than necessary, and because if there's nothing under the ground at the pasture's edge, then I have to start considering what's above it." Fenn asked, "And if there is something?" Roderick Vance said, "Then I have my answer, and I don't have to go above the mill wheel." Fenn recorded that evening. The sheriff is a rational man looking for a body, so he doesn't have to look for a door. That's the entire case in one sentence. Why we still discuss the Ashford family. The warrant required 2 days. During that time, Fenn remained at Delphia Mowat's and Reed Cash's, Ashford's account book twice more, and began to discover something else. Tucked into the leather, at the book's back cover, was a second, smaller notebook, not in Cash's handwriting but a young woman's, tight and even. O.T. Ashford's. She was 24 in autumn 1904. Had taught school for a term in Beverly 3 years earlier and returned home when her mother experienced a difficult winter. She never went back. Her notebook didn't begin with dates. The first page opened with a sentence. "If you're reading this, you're in our house, and you shouldn't be. The house is a good house, but it's at the wrong edge of the world." Fenn read the entire notebook by lamplight that night. Delphia Mowat didn't knock. She left him alone. Odie had written about the Sarvis Grove above the mill wheel. She wrote that the grove had existed since her grandfather Zephaniah claimed the ground. She wrote that in the years since her father inherited from his father, the grove had expanded. Not in the way trees grow, but outward. O.T. had made a small ink map on one page. In 1890, when she was 10, the grove measured about 30 yards across. In 1898, 40. In 1903, 60. In September 1904, she wrote, "It's 120 yards, and the deer path we used to walk to the ridge doesn't emerge where it used to. It comes out inside the grove now." That page bore a small corner tear, the kind made by a thumbnail unconsciously. She had written, "We can still walk in. We can still walk out. Father says we're not to go in, without one of us waiting at the near edge to call the others back. Father says the grove has begun to be honest, and that's what worries him most." She'd written a page in the middle about what she called the second sky. "Twice this summer, I've been in the yard at dusk and looked up through the Sarvis Grove's branches and seen above the treetops a piece of sky that wasn't our sky. It was daytime sky, blue with a sun. The sun was in the wrong position. I looked away and looked back. It was gone. I haven't told anyone. I'm afraid if I tell anyone, it will happen to them too. On the following page in smaller writing, she'd added, I've thought about this daily for 2 months. I believe our sky is a lid, and I believe the lid has started to shift. And I believe the reason it's shifting is us. We've been here too long. Grandfather brought us onto this ground, and Father kept us here. And now the ground knows our shape and is making room. I'd leave if Mother would leave. Mother won't leave. Mother has begun speaking to the walls. Not loudly, not so anyone would notice unless they watched her the way I watch her. She stands at the kitchen wall in the morning, moving her mouth, nodding sometimes as if the wall answers. She doesn't know I've seen this. I won't tell her. She'd written a page about sounds. Oti was meticulous about sounds. We hear the axe most often in the hour before sunset, when the light goes flat, maybe twice a week. It's not always the same place. Sometimes above the wheel, sometimes south toward the pasture, sometimes inside the walls. The way you hear a fly in a jar, and we go around the room and can't find it. Mother says it's only wood settling. Mother isn't stupid and knows it's not wood settling. But she's the mother, and she's allowed to say it. And we let her. Father doesn't say anything at all when the sound occurs. He waits for it to stop. He counts. I've watched him. He mouths the numbers. He never tells us what count he's reached. On the next page she'd written, we hear our own voices sometimes coming from the trees. Not calling. Just talking, as if the 4 of us were up in the grove, already having a conversation we haven't had yet. Absalom laughed once when he heard his voice, and the voice laughed back a second later, and then Absalom didn't laugh again all week. On the second to last page, Oti had written, Absalom went in yesterday to hunt turkey. He was in for 2 hours. When he came out, he had a full sack and was smiling. Said the hunting was very good, but he was wet from the knees down. It hasn't rained in 11 days, and the branch has been low, and there was no water in the grove where he'd walked. I looked at his boots and asked, Brother, where did you walk? He said, I walked the deer path and turned back at the ridge. I said, where did the water come from? He said, what water? And then he said, don't ask me again. He wasn't angry when he said it. He was pleading, asking me not to make him remember. I didn't ask again. On the final page, undated, she'd written only, Mother has decided we'll all go up together. Father has agreed. He says if the grove will keep growing, it's better to know what's in its center than to sit here and be surrounded. We'll go in the morning. If we come back, I'll finish this page. She hadn't finished the page. Fenn closed the notebook. He sat in the room for a long time without moving. He would later write that this was when he understood in a way he hadn't before what had happened to the Ashfords. They hadn't been taken. They had walked in, all 4 together in the morning, and they hadn't emerged. Now tell me, have you ever experienced that feeling of a place inviting you in a way that wasn't friendly? Not a warning, but an invitation. Share it in the comments. I want to know how many of you have felt that. The night before the warrant arrived, Fenn made a decision he would come to regret. He decided to spend the night at the Ashford cabin. He told Delphia Mowat he was going up to inventory household goods, which the county required in presumed departure cases. He rode up in late afternoon, tied the mule at the fence's near post, and carried a bedroll, lamp, rifle, memorandum book, and Delphia Mowat's bread, still uneaten, in his coat pocket. He built a fire in the cabin stove, using kindling from the wood box by the door. The wood box was full. Someone or something had kept it full. He ate a supper of cold bacon and hard cheese, sat at the table where the family had intended to sit, and read Cash's account book by lamplight. At full darkness, he heard the mill wheel begin turning. He looked through the window above the sink. Couldn't see the wheel from that window, but could hear it turning. He wrote, "It's louder from inside the house than from the yard. That's impossible." He recorded it anyway. Around 9 in the evening, the lamp began to dim. He turned up the wick. It dimmed again. He examined the lamp's base. The oil was full. He turned the wick as high as possible. The flame steadied. For a moment, he thought he saw the flame lean, not toward a draft, but toward the loft ladder, as if something up there were drawing it. He set the lamp down. He wrote in his journal, "The light in this house has a direction it wants to go." That's enough for one entry. Around 10, he heard footsteps on the porch. He didn't rise. He sat at the table with the rifle across his knees. The steps traversed the porch's length and stopped at the door, then retreated. Then returned and stopped at the door. This continued for perhaps 20 minutes. Each time the steps reached the door, it didn't open. He wrote, "They aren't trying the door. They're only knocking with their weight." At some point in the middle of the night, he couldn't later say when, he heard voices in the loft conversing, not loud. He listened for a long while and couldn't discern words, only conversational rhythm. He counted 3 voices, then 4, then briefly 5, then 5 again. He climbed the loft ladder halfway up and stopped, looking back at his rifle, then climbed back down. He wrote in his journal, "I didn't go up. I didn't go up because I've read the account book and the girl's notebook and know that going up alone into a room where 5 voices are conversing isn't what any Ashford would have done. And if they wouldn't have done it, I won't either." He sat in the chair by the stove for the remainder of the night. The loft voices continued until an hour before dawn, then ceased. He fell asleep in the chair a little before sunrise for perhaps 20 minutes and dreamed vividly of walking up a path through unfamiliar trees at a pace not his own. At the path's end was a clearing with a well, and around the well stood 4 people with their backs to him. He knew in the dream that if any turned, he wouldn't be able to look away. He woke before any turned. He rode down to Salt Lick Bend that morning with his rifle across his lap. He didn't stop at the mill wheel, didn't look at it, didn't look back. Delphia Mowat met him at the boarding house door, looked at his face, and said, "You stayed up there." He confirmed. She said, "You shouldn't have." She placed a plate before him and didn't speak to him again that day. The warrant arrived on the 3rd day. Roderick Vance rode up with 2 men from Elkins, shovel and pick, and Fenn followed. They excavated the pasture's edge where Ephraim Judd had indicated the unnamed stillborn was buried. They found the small remains exactly where expected. Nothing else. Roderick Vance sat on a stump, removed his hat, and said, "All right, Mr. Fenn. Now I have to consider what's above it." They walked to the cabin and sat on the porch. Roderick Vance said, "I'm going above the mill wheel. I'm going alone. If I'm not back by dark, I want you to ride to Elkins and report where I went." Fenn said, "I'm going with you." Roderick Vance said,
"No, you're not."
Fenn said, "Sheriff, with respect, I've read that girl's notebook. She said her father wouldn't let any go in without someone at the near edge to call the others back. If you go alone, there's nobody at the near edge." Roderick Vance considered this. He said, "Right, you come as far as the wheel. You don't cross. If I don't return in 1 hour, you leave. Ride to Elkins. Don't follow." Fenn agreed. They walked down to the mill wheel together. It was 3 in the afternoon. The wheel wasn't turning. The branch beneath it was low. Roderick Vance removed his hat, placed it on a stump at the wheel's near side, and walked across. Fenn recorded the exact moment, 3:10 p.m. He watched the sheriff ascend the path into the trees and vanish from sight. He counted his breaths. He watched the wheel. It began to turn about 10 minutes after Roderick Vance disappeared. Nothing moved in the branch to turn it. The moss on the stones hadn't shifted. No water pressed the paddles. The wheel turned anyway, slowly, and Fenn stood on the near bank watching it turn, not crossing. He kept his eyes on the trees. Once, he thought he heard from far up the path someone calling a name he couldn't quite catch. Once, he thought he heard laughter. Once, very clearly, he heard his own name called in his wife's voice, who was at that hour 130 miles away in Wheeling, and wouldn't have known where he was to call him. He didn't follow. He would later say, and I believe him, that not following the sheriff up that path was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than anything in the trenches in France 10 years later. Harder than watching his wife die of influenza in 18. He stood at the wheel for 1 hour by his own watch. Roderick Vance didn't return. Fenn picked up the sheriff's hat, walked to the cabin, mounted his mule, and rode down to Salt Lick Bend without stopping. He reached Elkins by midnight. Couldn't remember most of the ride. Only that the sheriff's hat on the saddle horn felt heavier the farther he traveled, though a hat cannot gain weight. The next morning, 16 men rode up from the county with rifles, rope, and lanterns. They assembled at Ephraim Judd's farm. Ephraim Judd wouldn't accompany them. He stood at his gate and said, "Don't go past the wheel. If you can't help yourselves and go past the wheel, don't stop walking. Walk straight. Don't answer if anyone calls your name from off the path, even if it's a name you know." He repeated this 3 times, and the 3rd time he was weeping. They went anyway. They searched the Sarvis Grove above the mill wheel for 2 days. Found nothing. No sign of the sheriff, no sign of the 4 Ashfords, no sign that a family had ever entered those trees. On the 2nd day, a searcher named Marcellus Boone sat on a log at the grove's edge and refused to rise. He said he'd heard his mother's voice from farther in. His mother had been dead 9 years. The others extracted him. He was never right afterward. He lived until 1931 in a home for the incurable in Weston, speaking no more than a dozen sentences in all those years. One sentence recorded by a nurse who wrote it down, because it was the first he'd spoken in a month, was, "They're all in the same room, and none can see each other." Nobody ever understood his meaning. Another searcher, a man named Cager Trice, told the county deputy afterward that he'd walked into the grove about 80 yards ahead of the main party, looked back, and couldn't see the near edge. The grove had closed behind him. He said he walked back the way he'd come, counting his steps straight, and when he emerged from the trees, he was on the ridge above the pasture, nowhere near where he'd entered. He said the entire experience took perhaps 6 minutes, and the sun was in the wrong position when he emerged, and he couldn't account for that. He resigned from the county 3 months later and went to work for the railroad. Never spoke of it again. The county closed the case in December 1904. Roderick Vance was listed as missing, presumed lost while searching for the Ashfords. The Ashfords were listed, in the county register's exact wording, as unaccounted for, likely departed the county without notice. That's the word the law signed off with, departed. Fenn wrote in his final report that the word, departed, was inadequate and that the record should reflect the true circumstances, that a family of 4 had entered a stand of trees above their own property and hadn't returned. His superiors accepted the report, didn't change the register's wording. Fenn resigned in the spring, took a position in Wheeling with a surveying firm, and never returned to Randolph County. He wrote in a letter to Callum Ashford, whom he'd eventually contacted in Cincinnati, that he didn't return because he feared the walk from Salt Lick Bend to Widow's Cut's head wouldn't be the same journey in reverse. Callum Ashford came to West Virginia in spring 1905, 31, tall like his father, with a limp from a factory injury the previous year. He went to the cabin, stayed one night, and wrote to Fenn afterward. The table was still set for 4. Someone or something has been maintaining the table setting. The letter my mother was writing to me remained on the sideboard, the pen untouched. I sat with it a long time. Didn't finish it for her. Didn't take it. If she wants to finish it, she will. He also wrote, "My father did the right thing sending me away. He knew what was on that ground. Had known it a long time. Must have known since boyhood. I don't know why he didn't leave. My best guess is a man doesn't abandon the ground his father broke, even when he should. I won't return to the cabin. I'd ask you not to either." There was one more paragraph in Callum's letter, which Fenn preserved. "On the night I stayed in the cabin, I heard my mother in the loft. She was singing. A song she used to sing when I was a boy before I went to Ohio. I stood at the ladder's bottom and called up to her. She stopped singing and said, 'Callum, is that you?' I said, 'Mother, it's me.' She said, 'We didn't think you'd come.' I said, 'Mother, are you all right?' She said, 'We're together.' I said, 'Mother, are you coming down?' She said, 'No, Callum, we can't come down. You come up.' I didn't go up. I lay in my father's bed and listened to her sing until sunrise. When light came through the window, she stopped. I got up, climbed the ladder, and looked. The loft was empty. One straw tick on the floor was still warm to the touch. I put my hand on it. It was as warm as if someone had just risen from it. I don't know if she's still there. I don't know if any of them are still there. I know I won't return. I know I'm the only one of the 5 not on that ground. And I know the ground is patient." Fenn kept that letter for the rest of his life. It was discovered among his papers when he died in 1941, placed inside the Ashford account book, which he'd also kept. Inside the account book, he'd placed Otie's smaller notebook. Inside Otie's notebook, he'd placed the sheriff's hat band, cut from the hat that night in Elkins, because he couldn't bear to keep the hat whole. All of that now resides in the State Archive, if you know where to request it. The cabin at Widow's Cut's Head stood empty another 20 years. No one bought the land, no one squatted. In 1926, a forest fire came up the ridge from the south and consumed the cabin, barn, and most of the pasture. Afterwards, the Sarvis Grove was gone too, or so the fire wardens reported. When people from Salt Lick Bend went up in spring 1927 to observe new growth, they said the grove stood exactly where it had been. Unscorched, untouched, perhaps a little larger. There's one more thing, then I'll release you. In 1952, 8 years after the Ashfords walked into those trees, a hiker from Charleston named Weston Corwin was reported missing from a Randolph County trailhead. Search parties deployed. On the 3rd day, one searcher walking along an old deer path emerging from what had once been Widow's Cut said he heard a woman's voice calling from farther up the ridge, calling a name he didn't recognize. He said, and this appears in the search report I've read myself, that the voice wasn't calling for help. It was calling the way a mother summons a grown son to supper. Warm, patient, certain the son would come. He didn't follow the voice. He was one who returned. Weston Corwin wasn't. His pack was found at the near edge of a stand of trees not shown on the map. Nothing else recovered. His case is one of the 10 in the collection I mentioned at the start. What the Mountain Keeps. If this is the kind you'd like more of, the link is in the description and pinned in the comments. And now the closing question. The one I always want you to contemplate before the credits arrive. If you were the assessor, if you were Alaric Fenn standing at the mill wheel, with the sheriff's hat in hand, and 1 hour on your watch. Hearing from up the path someone calling your name. Someone whose voice you recognized. Would you cross the wheel to answer them? Share it in the comments. I want to know. Stay with me. There's another one waiting.